Hi, everyone. I'm very happy to welcome you to this important session. And before we start, I just want to ask that we will be recording this webinar. So please, I need your, I just want you to be in the known that we will be recording this webinar. My name is Abdulahi. I work with Rikolto as the Global Director for Cocoa and Coffee. Rikolto, we are a proud member of Voice, and I currently serve as the board chair of Voice Network. I'm based in Ghana. I'm very happy to welcome you to this session. And once again, I would like to inform you that we have 3 different languages interpretations available. So in case you don't speak English, there are options available for you to get interpretation either in French or in Spanish. And we also have 2 of our distinguished panelists who will be speaking in either French or Spanish. So in case you don't speak any of these languages, please use the interpretation menu on the call. We have made interpretations available so that everybody will be able to follow this important session. Today, we are here to talk about an important topic, which is governance on living income. I've heard a lot of people talk about in terms of purchasing practices, in terms of productivity and what have you. But hey, one other important thing we often talk about is governance on living income. And let me say something that happened, I think last week I was in Dar es Salaam. I jumped into somebody and the person said, yeah, I love what you guys are doing in Voice Network. But hey, I feel you guys are very quiet in terms of governance issues on living income. Don't you think the government in producing countries, the government in consuming countries have something to do in terms of creating enabling environment for living income? And I said to the person, wait, we are coming out with a paper. And let me also indicate that this is a series. This is one of the papers we are working on as part of the Barometer Consortium papers that we will be publishing this year. In May this year, we will be publishing the Cocoa Barometer for 2025. So please follow Voice to be able to get access to what is happening in this. And let me indicate that this is a second paper we are publishing. The good governance paper is the second paper we are publishing as part of the barometer. The first paper was good purchasing practices, and all these things will feature in the barometer. And the final thing I want to say is that we have people from 3 important producing nations to share their views in terms of what is happening on good governance for living income. We also will have Antonie, who will take us through the paper, who will make a short presentation on the paper before the panel comes on board. So Antonie, without saying much, I will hand over to you to take over the rest of the session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abdulahi, and thank you for this introduction. And as you said, it's a topic that maybe is not addressed very often within this context of livelihoods for cocoa farmers. And so we felt it was time to go into that. Now, before I give a short outline of what the core part of the research is, I just really want to make sure that I first and foremost thank both Abdulahi as well as our wonderful panel here to bring in voices that aren't just people that look like me, but actually people that live in the daily reality of what the world is like in the real world of cocoa, not in the European world of cocoa, so to speak. So we're really happy to have a very strong panel today to bring in different perspectives from government, from farmer and civil society, as well as from the trade side, to give a very strong overview of different perspectives, also from quite a few different origin countries. What we'll do today is I will give a short presentation of the paper. After that, we're going to have quite a large panel conversation with Siapha Kamara from Send in Ghana, with Merlyn Casanova from Anecacao Anecacao in Ecuador, with His Excellency Alex Asanvo from the Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana Cocoa Initiative, and with Bakary Traoré from IDEF in Côte d'Ivoire. And so we really hope to have a very honest and a lively conversation around this. But I think it's also very important to show that this paper and the findings that we're going to give today are firstly some very rough sketches of contours of a conversation that I think that the more we have this as a cocoa sector, the better we will get at shading the different shaded areas, the better that we will get at actually finding out what needs to be at the center of this conversation and which issues we might not. Because we've been looking a lot into this paper, and while I was doing the research for it, I found there's actually not that much that's been written about this yet as well. And so therefore we at the Cocoa Barometer often feel quite comfortable starting conversations on topics that might not have a lot of documentation yet. And so we think this is a first step in the conversation, but we're also very much aware that there is a lot of depth that can still be had in this conversation. So bear with us in this first step of the conversation. Some of these points might not have to be as fleshed out as well as they could be, and some might be going into far too much detail, and we might think later, oh, you know what, maybe other topics require stronger focus within this. However, I do think it's important to embed this idea of governance in a broader conversation. For the last 2 decades, when we've talked about farmer poverty as a cocoa sector, we've often talked about it in a way where the solutions are diversified income or higher productivity or farmer innovation, a lot of issues around good agricultural practices, as if that was the single way by which farmer poverty could be solved. And that also means that it also would look like that was the problem was actually the farming itself rather than a lot of the issues around it. And as you might have seen in the previous Cocoa Barometer, the one from 2022, where we said there's 3 major areas that you need to look at when you're looking at farmer poverty. And you can't just focus on one of them because you're not going to solve the issue. Yes, we need to look at good agricultural practices, but we also need to look at good purchasing practices. And for this last year, we brought out a paper outlining the core aspects of what those are. But the third element that we very much need to look at is also around good governance. What is the role of the origin governments within this conversation? And so that's something that we're very much looking at in this paper, trying to look at this in detail. Now, what is important within that context is that there is an order of responsibility when we look at these 3 triangles. And though for the first 20 years of this conversation, we first looked at what the farmers need to be doing differently, I think that the conclusion of the Voice Network is that actually that's the wrong order. There is a business case that you make for good agricultural practices by putting in place good governance and by putting in place good purchasing practices. So first steps need to be taken by industry and government so that it actually becomes interesting for farmers to actually start investing in good agricultural practices. And so even though all 3 of these elements are important, we've often had the order of chronology wrong here. And so we really believe that the first mover responsibility lies with the industry as well as with the governments. And today we're going to be focusing largely on the role of the governments. Now, if we look at what good governance for living income in cocoa looks like, the core of what we're really looking at here, in essence, is at 6 main buckets. And I'll go into them in a lot more detail in a second, but the 6 buckets are issues around rural development strategies, around infrastructure, around transparency and accountability, around the rule of law, around supply management, and around consumer government policies. Now, I could stop there and start for the conversation, but I think it does require a little bit further unpacking. And so when we talk about rural development strategies, there's several things that I'd like to highlight here, and a lot of this is in more detail and in more nuance in the paper. So I strongly advise everyone to read the paper in detail, which is, by the way, out not just in English, but also in French and in Spanish, so that it kind of reflects the various geographies that cocoa comes from. But when we're talking about rural development strategies, we're talking about the development of a long-term vision of the governments for what they want with their countries and with their rural countryside. countrysides, where they look at agriculture and particularly at cocoa communities, but also other communities there, not just as cash cows for foreign exchange currencies, not just a way to get dollars or pounds into your coffers, but to actually see how can we develop the communities in the work that they do. And in order to get there, we're going to need to see landscape roadmaps that also have a governance perspective of getting the voices of the local communities in there as well. And so it's not just the capitals developing these roadmaps, but it's actually making sure that farmer organizations, that local communities, that the voices of rights holders are very much involved in the development of these roadmaps from the very beginning. And it's also very essential, and I'm probably going to bring it up a couple of times in today's conversation, that these are not just looking at a male-dominated narrative, but that they very much look at how do we bring women into this? How do we bring women into the problem analysis? How do we bring solutions for women into the development here as well? Because a properly developed rural countryside is actually a countryside where women have a very strong and empowered role to play. So this is a really key part of the first big bucket. And I know that I'm going through this far too quickly, but rural development strategies actually stand or fall at the beginning and at the end of all of these governance policies. But it goes a lot more in depth than just that. And so when we look at infrastructure, we're looking at a lot of different ways how we can better organize the infrastructure. And it might be surprising to you to see that we put farmer organization as the first item in infrastructure. But without farmers and communities being well organized, a lot of the other things are going to be so much harder to get off the ground. And so part of the government policy needs to be there to ensure that farmers have the agency and that they are facilitated to better be organized, not just as cooperatives, but also as organized groups of entities with rights holders, being heard, being involved in conversations. But beyond that, infrastructure also deals with a lot of the usual suspects when we're talking about infrastructure. Education and healthcare. If you provide the proper schools, if you provide healthcare, it actually vastly reduces the burden on livelihoods for farmers. And I think there's an organization, for example, organizations like Elucid that have really been challenging the cocoa sector over the last 4 or 5 years to say, hey, look, make sure you bring in the issue of community healthcare and access to healthcare, because it affects farmers' ability to earn income, it affects farmers' ability to care for their families, etc. But it's not just education and healthcare. It also is really the hardcore infrastructure of roads and access to market, and actually creating spaces where diversified income becomes viable for farmers because they've actually got a local market to sell their products to, and not just to the next village, but roads that actually mean that there's a much better connection between what you're growing here and a market that you could sell 100 or 200 kilometers down the road, so that they're actually, you start developing a much stronger local market. Another really key aspect around this is around electricity and water supply. This ties into the healthcare issues, but it also ties into the broader costs of business. It ties into the ability of local communities to professionalize and to get a lot stronger. But there's also policy elements where it comes to infrastructure, where we're talking about social protection systems and pension schemes, where we're talking about minimum wages. And maybe Merlyn will mention a little bit about this or not, but I find a great example of this to be in Ecuador, when in 2014, they introduced much higher minimum wages for all the wage workers in the agricultural countryside, thereby actually pushing up the incentive also for farmers to get a higher income as well. And so kind of, it's a tide that floats all boats there. And so kind of making sure that you're not competing your day wage laborers with smallholder households, because what we often see in a lot of the solutions that we just say, oh, you know, simply hire laborers. But if you're not hiring laborers at a living wage level, then you're just transferring your living income problem from the smallholder to the wage worker. And so you need to put in place these kind of structures as well. But beyond infrastructure, we're starting to look at issues around transparency and accountability. And that can be a wide range of topics where governments need to be a lot more transparent and a lot more accountable, whether that's about national traceability systems, whether that's about impact reporting. I think two great examples of this are around the EUDR, but also around child labor and kind of how traceable and how transparent are we? How many problems are we finding? And how effective are we in solving these problems? But also around issues such as market transparency. Currently, the price is very high, but in the two countries that have forward selling principles, there are a lot of questions around, so where is that money going? Like, is that money coming to the farmer, or is that money getting stuck somewhere in the middle? How are prices set? How are farmers benefiting from high prices? How are farmers being protected from low prices? Because this current high market system won't last forever, right? It will go down at some point. And then the question is also, how do you protect farmers well enough? So that ties also very directly with government income and government spending. But I also think a really key part of around transparency and accountability is also around the issue of civic space. And so that's got to do with what role does civil society have in holding governments accountable? So it's not just about whether or not as a government you're being transparent about what you're doing, but it's also what space do you give the media, what space do you give civil society to hold governments accountable? For example, in price setting structures or in other aspects, is do you engage with civil society in your country to actually allow them to be a part of the policy conversations at different levels? So that's when we come to transparency, accountability. And what you will find is that a lot of these topics slowly kind of one merges into the other, because then when we go from these issues of civic space and holding governments accountable, quite quickly you also come to the issue of rule of law. Is the rule of law the same for everybody? Or does it help when your stepfather has a very high position in government? Or does it help when your clan has got direct connections to the National Cocoa Marketing Board, etc.? Are those rules the same for everybody? Also around issues that come much closer to farm level. Do you have access to land and tree tenure? And do you actually have the ownership rights to use your farm in the way that is necessary? Do you have access to remedy if somebody does abuse the power that they have? How is the enforcement of these issues happening at a national level? Are people actually obliged to stick to the rule of law, or can they just do what they want? And are there no consequences for breaches of contract, for example? And then there's also the issue of corruption, because what we have seen, and very often in West Africa in the cocoa sector, that there's a lot of self-enrichment taking place by people that have a lot of power. But that is a very uncomfortable reality if you look at the daily poverty of the farmers themselves. And so we need to really see some very strong anti-corruption measures there as well. The last point at a government level from an origin country is around how markets work and supply management. Now, the current really high world market prices are a direct result of several very failed harvests, right? There's not enough cocoa, and that means that we're seeing a lot of high prices, right? And that shows how important supply and demand are to how much farmers are being paid. But what we're also seeing is that supply and demand doesn't really work for farmers, right? So we're seeing that farmers are always the price takers. What is the role that governments can take to actually help be part of a buffer between the supply and demand of the market and the farmers? Now, where it comes to wages and farm workers, it can be the implementation of minimum wages. But at a broader level, we can be looking at something that's becoming a bit of a buzzword in the cocoa sector, which is the word decommoditization, which is really stepping away from the idea that supply and demand are the only point that dictates how much a farmer should get. It doesn't mean that there's no role, that there shouldn't be a role for supply and demand, but it shouldn't be the only determinant of how high the prices are for farmers. Part of that can and should be supply management. And I think that this is a problem that goes, or a challenge that goes way beyond just West Africa. I think that actually all of the major cocoa growing nations should start working together quite effectively and transparently around how much cocoa is the right amount of cocoa to put on the world market. Because over the last decade and a half, there's been a real rush to see everybody wanted to produce more and more and more. And that creates a glut. And gluts are not good for farmers as well. So how do we work on that? But how do we also make sure that there's open dialogues around what the right way forward is? And that also has got to do with what's the role of the markets in this. How do, for example, in Côte d'Ivoire and in Ghana, how does the forward selling system work? I'm not one of those voices that in the current high market thinks the forward selling system should be abolished, but I think there should be more transparency there. But I also remember 2016-17 when the market completely collapsed. And actually, that forward selling played a really important role in protecting farmers from low prices. So I really think we need to watch out that we don't throw away the baby with the bathwater around this current high price situation to say, let's get rid of the forward selling. But we do need to find a way that it works better and more transparently. There's also an issue of taxes and competition, because what we often hear a lot of the big companies complain about, they're like, oh, some of these countries we pay a lot of taxes, and other countries the farmer gets the whole world market price. And my question then is, if you've been paying attention to the rest of my presentation, there have been a lot of things that governments have to do. They need to build roads, they need to build schools, they need to make sure that there's electricity, that there's clean water, that there's education, et cetera, health clinics. None of that comes for free, right? And so if the role of the governments is to make sure that that infrastructure is there, then surely that government needs to be able to tax as well, right? So there's a give and take there that I think too often, especially in the private sector, they're like, oh, we don't want to pay taxes and we don't want to be responsible for the infrastructure. And I think that there's a real dichotomy there. And I think that that dichotomy and the hypocrisy actually gets even bigger if you realize that Europe and North America heavily subsidize their agriculture, right? Like our agriculture in Europe and the agriculture in North America is not a market-based solution. It's a subsidy-based solution, and it's paid for by other parts of our economy. So why would it be fair to expect not just West African agriculture or Latin American agriculture to pay for itself, but also to pay for the full development of the rest of the country? I think that there's a real double standard that we use there that needs to be addressed in this concept as well. And that brings me also to what is the role of governments in consuming nations? And I think that there's three key elements there. And this is the last bullet sets that we have, and then we'll dive into the Q&As. But the consumer government policies are first and foremost, they really need to start making it mandatory to have living income in their regulations. And so living income and the abuse of farmer poverty should not be a voluntary thing that is up to companies to decide whether or not they're okay with it. That should just simply not be an option. I think the second thing is we need a lot more investment in global funding. And when we wrote this paper, the American disastrous cuts on USAID were not even dreamed of yet. I mean, it's been an absolutely disastrous several weeks there. But we are also seeing in Western Europe, we're seeing the amount of money available for foreign aid, whether that's in Germany or in the Netherlands or in Belgium or in England, being drastically cut at the moment. And that is a really, really problematic development as well. And so we need to see a lot more funding from the consuming nations, because we're earning so much more money off the cocoa supply chain than the beginning of the supply chain is. So we have a lot more responsibility to make sure that there is funding there as well. And I would say that the third thing that we need to change in consuming nations is we need a critical review of competition law, because the current way the competition law is written is that we only acknowledge competition law as an issue for the consumer. And so yes, there's market power. Market power is bad for the consumer. But the argument that market power can also be bad for the first producer, that seems to be completely ignored in all of the competition law. And we need to find a way around that to make sure that market power does not result in the exploitation of farmers as well. So to summarize and to bring this into landing, we really need to see a lot more investment in rural development strategies. We need to see a lot more investment and governments coming to the plate where it comes to infrastructure, not just the traditional hard physical infrastructure, but also making sure that farmers and civil society and the local civic space is heard and part of the conversation. We need to see a lot more transparency and accountability at government level, as well as a rule of law that counts for everyone. And we need to see the origin governments working on supply management and how markets work. Now, We can't just leave it there. We also need to look at what do the consuming governments need to be doing differently around the regulations, around the funding of global supply chains, as well as around how we think competition law is working. That in short is the summary of the paper. But before we go to the dialogue, I want to have two very short last points, and these aren't bullets because you guys are, those of you that hear me speak very often are not used to me having this many bullet points as I have had, but that's because this is really dense material, and I wanted to make sure we've got most of the points coming over to you guys. But there's two really key narrative issues that I think we really need to watch out when we talk about governance. And the first is that this does not become an issue of the private sector pointing at the government sector saying they need to go first, right? So the first is, what is the role of corporations here? And so both the governments and the companies need to be changing their practices. And there's this internet meme around these two Spider-Mans pointing at each other saying, you know, I'm the real Spider-Man. No, I'm the real Spider-Man. This is the same kind of a thing. You cannot just be pointing at the others. And in fact, the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, the first guiding principle says that it is the government's duty to protect human rights. But the second principle says that it is the corporation's responsibility to respect human rights. And that's usually where people stop talking about the UN guiding principles. But that sentence actually continues. And the second guiding principle says that it is the corporation's responsibility to respect human rights, even when governments haven't taken up their responsibility. And so this kind of an argumentation around the role of governance cannot be used as an excuse by the private sector to simply wait for governments to get their act in order before they have to start moving. So it's not a get out of jail free card for the corporations. This is very much a call to action for everyone to get moving. And I think the second really important part of the narrative there as well, when we were drafting this paper, and we went through a lot of rounds of revisions with our members, and particularly with our members and stakeholders in origin countries, one of the points that came out there is this shouldn't be read as a very simple, lame excuse for the origin government should simply not be poor. And I think that this is, it reminded me of something from, there's this historic saying of Marie Antoinette, the wife of the French king during the French Revolution, where they were very angry, where the people were very angry that they were so poor they couldn't even eat bread. And then she uttered the famous words, "Let them eat cake instead," right? And so someone that is so entrenched in their richness that they don't understand that there's no alternative for bread. And I think the same thing we need to say in this. You can't simply tell origin governments, don't be poor, right? That's not how it works. One of the reasons why cocoa and other commodities are grown in lower income countries, it's by design. Cocoa follows poverty, right? In the same way that all these commodities are designed to go to places where there is not a very high level of income, because that is how the business model works. So you can't just simply tell origin governments, stop being poor. That's not how it works. So we need to say, yes, we need to work on these things without blaming a country for being poor and without using it as an excuse for corporate inaction. So those are two very important parts of the narrative there. Having said that, moving on towards the Q&A, this good governance is, as I said at the beginning, and I'll round it off there, it's a first attempt at having this conversation. And I think we're going to get a lot better at this in the coming years. But for that, we really need to have an open conversation, which is what we have this, this panel, which we'll have for the rest of the call now. And so we've got some prepared questions, but we'd also very much like to hear from the people in the audience. And so we've got a Q&A system where you can write your questions in, and I think you can actually upvote your other people's questions as well. So ones that get a lot of votes will get more attention first. But we have some first questions for our panel, but I'd like to introduce our panel before we start there, and maybe you can all turn your camera on as well. So we've got His Excellency Alex Asanvo, who is the Executive Secretary for the Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana Cocoa Initiative. Thank you very much for joining us today, Alex. We have got Abdulahi Aliyu, who is the head of cocoa and coffee at Rikolto. He is also the chair of my board. So technically speaking, Abdulahi is my boss. I will be nice to you today. Thank you for joining us today, Abdulahi. We have Merlyn Casanova joining us from Anecacao, the Ecuadorian Cocoa Exporters Association. So thank you very much for joining us today, Merlyn. And it wasn't until after we planned this that we realized it is actually a public holiday in Ecuador, and it is very early. So thank you very much for getting up early on your free day to join us for this important conversation. Mucho gusto. And we're also very grateful to have Siapha Kamara on the call today. And Siapha is the CEO of the Send in Ghana, which is a NGO in Ghana, one of our members as well, and Send hosts the Ghanaian Civil Society and Cocoa platform. And then the last panelist that we have today is Bakary Traoré. And Bakary is the head of IDEF, an Ivorian NGO working on forest protection and for vibrant communities in Côte d'Ivoire. Bienvenue, Bakary. Bakary and Merlyn will both be speaking in their own languages, so respectively in French and in Spanish. So once again, if those are not your natural languages, then feel free to use the interpretation that is there, as I will as well. Now, thank you all for being here. And Alex, maybe I can start with a question for you. There's a whole list of homework here that you could, so to speak, consider as homework for origin government. So far, a lot of the work that you've done at CIGHCI over the last several years has focused around pricing issues, such as the living income differential. When you hear these other points around the role of origin governments, do you think that there could be a role for CIGHCI or for either the Cocoa Bod and the CCC in streamlining some of the issues that we've described in this paper?
Yes, thank you, Antonie. No, I'm very pleased for this invitation, and thank you again for that. It's always a great opportunity. So CIGHCI, as you mentioned, so the Côte d'Ivoire Ghana Cocoa Initiative has been focusing on more than just pricing. I think the pricing were the issues that have more attraction from the media, but also that's where there were a lot of emotions and a lot of actions. But CIGHCI is beyond and is more than price, right? So price is only one element out of the bigger picture, what we call economic of cocoa. Within the initiative, we have two big committees. One is on production and research, where we have been handling CSSV, so bilateral discussion and collaborative discussion, exchange. We have been discussing a lot of issues regarding smuggling, and some action has been done by the countries very quietly so that there's no more noise. But some have been, recently you heard what has happened in Côte d'Ivoire, and you heard some of the catch in Ghana, where people are hiding cocoa in trucks and pretending this is rubbers and going across the borders and goes to the ports, and et cetera, et cetera. So there is a lot of happening more than that. But also on pricing, I wanted to add to the fact that we think only about LID, but the LID was for us to set a base and a common ground on what minimum price could be that can help us delivering a decent income for farmer. But beyond that, the two countries have been coordinating the past 3.5 years, each season's price announcement. So if you see the way the price announcement has been made, the two countries have been coordinating, partnering, assessing, because we have calculation that's assess the gaps that we have between the two countries. But again, there is always challenges. So currency challenges that sometimes make the gaps a bit higher than what has been planned. But in dollar, if you revert in dollar, the calculation were always right, and it's create problems. So I think that just to clarify that. So price is important, but it's not only price that will solve the current issue. And I heard very few things like, for example, prices are high and we don't know where the price is going. We don't know how much is going to the farmer, etc. And I think this is where we need to collaborate more, civil society, government, but also the market, because I think there is a misunderstanding of what price is. Today, if you see $9,000 price for us, Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, that's not the price our cocoa is being paid for. Our cocoa is being paid on a certain calculation that is much more complex than what we simplify. And the forward sales is one aspect, but there's also spot. So I think that there are a few areas, but no one, at least so far I'm aware, no one is buying cocoa $10,000 in Cote d'Ivoire or in Ghana. So that I can tell you today. So we can go deep into this, and we can share some of this, because there is a lot of misinterpretation. But we tend to, and I think, thank you, Antonie, for flagging the fact that forward sales has also helped protecting farmers past years. High price we see is, we are in the second year where we see this level of price, but we are coming for over 60 years where price were below $2,000. All right, below even the cost of production for the production of cocoa. So I think that's also something we need to revert, and that brings us to the governance. I think the
Exactly, because we need to talk about not just about price, right? And I think part of this is really to look at how does government policies, the transparency, accountability, the rule of law, how is that a role that kind of going forward CIGHCI can really play a role in?
Exactly. And I think that that's exactly what we have tried when we launched the LID. The LID was to set up this framework in which we have brought the industry together, we have brought the government together to discuss a framework in which we can really assess the transparency of what price level, etc. And it has brought us to certain tensions. And these tensions have brought us to good learnings. And the learnings are very simple. The learnings are to the level where, as you said in your paper, we need governance. And governance is not just about the price frame, right? But the governance need to take the history. And sorry if I'm longer, but I think it's very important that I flag the history of cocoa governance. There were a governance that was
very quickly there, Alex, because we do want to turn this into a conversation.
All right. So there were a cocoa governance that, because it's important for your paper, governance that has been put together in the 70s that has failed, simply failed, and today we are facing the result of it. So ICCU has been created, International Cocoa Organization has been created out of this deal between the importing and the exporting country on a specific quota and the must sell and the must buy process, in which both parties, very few years only, have failed to fulfill, and simply because you had free riders. And today, when you come to the LID, living income differentials, that's almost the same, except that the market has always the opportunity beyond Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana to go and buy somewhere else. And beyond that, we talk about the link with supply management. Supply management cannot only be just very few. It has to be everyone. And if we put the governance, we need to make sure that free riders are being avoided, because this is what has failed every system. An investment, whether it's private sector or some governments, are investing more and more to produce more, while some may try to reduce. And today, if prices
so does this mean that as CIGHCI, you're also trying to engage with other governments to kind of bring CIGHCI into a broader conversation? For example, Cameroon, Nigeria, Ecuador, Brazil, etc.
Correct. And I had several conversations with Cameroon almost 2 years ago. Nigeria, same, and I have few visits ahead of me this year's. But we also had a recent conversation with Brazil, and I think I met some stakeholders in Ecuador, and even Togo and many other countries, like even Gabon recently, we had some exchange. So just to show that it's not just Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana. The initiative has started with Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, but in a perspective to go bigger. And I think we are in the framework. And so that, I think this is the few points I wanted to bring into that perspective. So let's look, in Africa, we always say, you need to know where you come from to know where you're going. And I think we need to explore the failure of the cocoa agreement that was made in the 70s and to where we are today from the LID, living income differential, and to the projections of where we are in the current market. But one thing to conclude, sorry, Antonie, I think it's important that we all start to understand at some point we are reaching a point where we are talking about good versus bad cocoa. So good cocoa is a cocoa that is produced sustainably, that is delivered the right income, that cover cost of production, and that include all the externalities of the production. And I think this is good versus the bad, what we see now, cocoa is being smuggled out of our countries and still arrive in Europe or goes to Asia and different markets. And this is bad cocoa. And if we manage to get a proper governance at the right level, and I think ICCO could be a good platform. The initiative has set the example, and we are ready and we are willing to engage in any conversation in that direction. So I think I will stop here because I know the time is tight, but
Thanks,
I
Alex.
wanted to outline some of these elements.
And I might actually come to Merlyn later around these ICCO issues, because Merlyn has actually just recently been appointed the vice chair of the
Yes.
consultative board of the ICCO. But I think before we go there, I'd like to go to Bakary. Bakary, you're one of the key spokespeople for civil society in Côte d'Ivoire, the world's biggest cocoa producer country. And with your many years of experience on the ground in kind of the world's largest cocoa economy, how, like, we talk a lot about improving transparency and accountability for farmer income. How, with all of your experience there, do you think additional transparency and accountability would benefit the farmers that you often work with, the communities that you're involved with?
Thank you, Anthony. I will speak French. Donc, ceux qui ne comprennent pas français, vous pouvez utiliser l'interprétation.
For those who do not understand French, please listen to the interpretation.
Attends, j'ai le retour en fait de l'interprétation.
Now I hear the English interpretation in my headphones.
So Bakary, il faut que
Oui,
you've
je
got
l'ai mis sur français.
probably change the translation setting. So this is a joke I often do make, but there will always be.
Je pense que c'est bon maintenant, Anthony.
Ça marche, Bakary? Okay, good.
Oui, c'est bon maintenant. En fait, j'étais sur l'anglais. J'ai dû mettre
I
sur français pour ne
was
pas entendre
on the
l'anglais.
English channel,
Maintenant, je
so now I should
Merci beaucoup de
switch
me donner
channels.
l'opportunité
Thank you very
d'exprimer
much for giving me the opportunity to
dans
address
cet événement très
you
intéressant.
during
Je voulais
this
juste
interesting
commencer
event.
en
I would like
partant
to
de l'opinion
start
d'Alex sur en Afrique. C'est important,
by
on vous dit
explaining
que c'est
that in
important de
Africa,
savoir d'où on
it's
vient pour savoir où
important
on
to
va.
know
C'est
where
juste
you come
exactement
from, to know
très important qu'on ait
where
ça
you
à
will
l'esprit,
go. You
surtout
need
quand
to
on
keep
parle
that in
des
mind,
cacao.
especially when you
Moi, je vais
talk
pas
about
aller
the
très loin
cocoa
même dans le calendrier, juste
supply
décennie
chain.
2010-2020,
Now,
quand on
in
regarde
the
les chiffres,
decade between
on se rend compte que
2020
oui, les prix du
2010,
cacao dépassaient
you
à peine les
see
3000.
that
Quand
the
on disait aux gens
cocoa
d'acheter le cacao
price has
à 2500 et trouvaient que
increased.
c'était déjà énorme. Donc
And
aujourd'hui, on a des
in the
chiffres
past, they
qui donnent le
were
tournis,
already
voilà, et
considered to be
effectivement,
very
ça donne
high.
des éléments. Et je pense qu'une
Now,
des premières
I
difficultés,
do believe
et c'est bien qu'on parle de transparence et de
that we
responsabilité,
should talk
une des
about
premières difficultés,
transparency.
Alex l'a mentionné un petit peu
And
aussi, c'est de
one
dire que c'est une filière
difficulty
complexe
is that
et
it
que
is a
tous les éléments
difficult
ne sont pas
supply
satisfaisants.
chain, and
Les
not all
calculs
the elements are the same
fixation des
everywhere.
prix, etc.,
The
sont
way
complexes.
the
À
price
combien
is
sont vendus
calculated
réellement
is complex.
comment
At
dire, le
what
cacao, les contrats,
price
etc. C'est
cocoa
des
is
données qui
really
sont
sold
pour l'instant considérées
depends.
comme
You
des données
also have
commerciales,
these
donc on ne peut pas y croire
illegal
beaucoup, etc.
selling of cocoa,
Mais ces éléments-là,
which
nous on
is
l'entend en
smuggled
tant que
out of the
société civile, on comprend
countries.
tout à fait d'un point de vue
But
technique que
we,
oui, c'est
representatives
compliqué
of
de mettre
civil
ces données-là dans sur
society,
la place publique. Mais on pense que tel que
hear about
la
these
filière a été
things,
pensée, le
but
système de commercialisation a été pensé, il a été pensé dans une logique où il y
the
avait un trop plein de
system
cacao
cocoa
sur le
is
marché et que
sold
il y avait un
is
risque qu'on ne puisse pas vendre le
not
cacao.
set up
Aujourd'hui, on est
in a
dans,
very
on a le
sound
sentiment qu'on rentre dans
way.
une nouvelle ère
We
où
believe
on
we
va plutôt
now
vers
come
la
in a
rareté du
new
cacao et
era
donc ça explique, entre autres, tous ces sujets. La
where
question, c'est de savoir si ce
we
système
need
est
to
adapté à ce nouveau
understand
contexte.
whether the
Nous, on a déjà
system is
mis
still
sur la table certaines
appropriate for the
réflexions
new
au niveau de la
context.
Côte d'Ivoire parce qu'on a un
So
système
in
qui est différent de
Ivory
certains autres
Coast,
pays.
we have a different system
Notre
than
demande,
elsewhere,
ce n'est pas de changer
and
le système
our
pour en faire un système
ask
libéralisé,
is not to
libéral, parce
change the
que, encore une fois,
system
il faut se rendre compte
because
que les prix, ça monte, ça
liberalization
descend,
has
peut-être quand ça descend, souvent ça fait
consequences,
mal,
and when prices go
mais
down, it
d'arriver
hurts. But we
à
want
réfléchir
to
sur une sorte
get
de flexibilité dans
to
ce système, de sorte que
introducing
même le fait,
flexibility into the
le fait d'acheter
system
le cacao
to make
au-delà du
sure that
prix qui est fixé par
buying
par
cocoa
le Conseil
at a
du
higher
cacao ne soit
price
pas
than the
considéré comme une
fixed
pratique
price
illégale.
should not be considered to be illegal. It's crazy because we all want to increase the income for the producers, and then you cannot pay a higher price. So in the field, people buy or sell their cocoa at a higher price than the government has fixed, and this is considered to be illegal, and it may be coherent with all the other measures, but for the producers, this is not considered to be fair. They have something to sell, and they find a party wishing to pay more, and then they can't because it's considered to be illegal. So it's counterproductive. It's counterproductive. We
So
need
if I
to think for a new system.
So if I understand you correctly, one of the things that you're saying is that the way farmers are actually paid at farm gate level requires a different approach from a governance perspective. Is that correct, Bakary?
No, Antonie. In Ivory Coast, the price is 1,800 francs. Some people say that they were prepared to pay 2,000 francs. So those people, when they want to pay more, it's considered illegal. They do not have the right to pay a producer 2,000 francs. So the council was forced to publish a document stating that paying more for cocoa is illegal and they will be sanctioned. So in the field with the producers, they do not understand this. And they are prepared to go cross-border to sell their harvest elsewhere. So we should understand the specifics of the situation and the forces at play. And the producers need to understand how the prices are calculated and why they are fixed at a certain level and why the system is so rigid. We talk about
Understood.
responsibility. Now, I come to a conclusion. Our responsibility of every stakeholder, civil society included, is that we should say, okay, this supply chain has enriched many actors, but not the producers. And we should all take on our part of responsibility. And noting that the prices are so high, we need to do something. We can't stay like this for 10 more years. And some farmers or cocoa chocolate producers go to Latin America to buy cacao because it might be cheaper than the African cocoa. So governance should also take into account the responsibility of the exporting counties. There was always the opinion that it was the responsibility of the importing countries, but rules and regulations should be clear. And in Europe, stakeholders are alarmed because of the text published stating that some things would be sanctioned, but in Ivory Coast, we want to make sure that cocoa cannot be bought at low prices. That's it for me. Thank you,
Thank you so
Antonie.
much, Bakary. There's so much to unpack in both what you said and what Alex has said around kind of the way these different aspects interlink with each other. And I find it interesting that where we've tried to write a paper that looks beyond price and looks more at the governance side of things, we do keep coming back to the issue of kind of how much farmers are getting. And I think that a lot of the government policies also influence how much farmers are actually receiving for their cocoa. And so that's like a real component that we also need to start unpacking more in details, like how the transparency, how the working of the markets, how the how the actual regulations around whether or not farmers are allowed to be paid more than the fixed prices, etc. Part of that also has to do, and Siapha, I want to come to you right now. Part of that also has to do with, I think, one of the points that you've been arguing for quite a while now around the need for farmers and for farmer organizations and local communities to be much more heard and much more part of these conversations, rather than them being told what's going to happen to them, that they actually get to be much more part of the conversation, of the policy dialogue there. In that context, Siapha, what steps are needed right now, do you think, to help farmers better self-organize so that they can be a stronger market actor themselves, so that they don't have to ask for something, but so that they actually can operate from their own strength to demand things?
Thank you, Antonie, and for the good overview you gave of the paper. And I'm glad that you introduced the discussion on governance and living income, because poor living income for farmers is a direct reflection of poor governance of the cocoa sector. So trying to talk about living income without putting in the context of governance, for me, was always a difficult thing to comprehend. So, and I think that once you're talking about governance, then you're talking about decision-making. You cannot have decision-making when people are not heard. And that's what has kept cocoa in the context of Ghana, which is one of the highest foreign exchange earners, yet cocoa farmers are also among the poorest because they are not around the table where decisions are made about their sector. And that is why we in CIGHCI prioritize the importance of organizing cocoa farmers, or the cocoa farmers organizing themselves to be self-organized. You know, the good things about the changes that are taking place in Africa, in Ghana in particular, is that now we have democracy. And in a democracy, people organize around self-interest. So if cocoa farmers are not well organized as they are now, that is why the prices does not reflect the prices that the cocoa board gets. Other interests in the sector, as one of the speakers have said, are benefiting because the farmers are not well organized. Their voices are not around the table. And we in CIGHCI would like to see farmers well organized. Now, what is a well-organized cocoa farmer organization? How will it be so useful in addressing the merit of problems that we have in the cocoa sector? You know, the cocoa sector in Ghana, if you look at it from the farmer side, there's not one group of farmers. So you have sharecroppers, you have people who are laborers, you have people who own their own land, you have some who have few hectares. So there a lot of work has to be done at that level, that educating a group of farmers, different categories of farmers, about if you live in a Ghana, which is a democracy, the only way you will get your issues about good pricing, about participating in the governance of making policy, is to have farmers well organized. That call for education of farmers, for them to know that they have a right. You have to know that the cocoa structure we have is part of the colonial legacy, which did not recognize the rights of farmers. Even now, the market forces. So we need to educate farmers about their right to organize, about their right to be heard. Cocoa Board, I think that the time is over for Cocoa Board to be the spokesperson for the cocoa sector alone. The voices of the farmer should be heard about policy. More importantly, the inputs that they get. The cocoa farmers have absolutely very little about the type of inputs that they get. And you know, it is the input that drives production. So if you have very little to say about the type of credit, the type of seed, the type of fertilizer, and how those are administered, they're just given to you, and you have to take what comes. So I think that it is very important. You know, one of the challenges.
So Siapha, I'm probably going to come back to you in a couple of minutes again, but I also want to make sure that we create some space for Merlyn here. Thank you so much for this really useful perspective around kind of getting farmers more at the table, getting farmers more involved as well in the conversations around what they need from the governments as far as inputs is concerned. Crossing the Atlantic to look at kind of the world's sometimes, well, almost number 2 producer of cocoa by now is Ecuador. Merlyn, we've seen quite a lot of, Ecuador starting to become a bigger player in the world's cocoa sector. But I remember when I first came to Guayaquil just about 8-9 years ago, there had just been a big agricultural reform in Ecuador where the government had put in place new wage structures, the Salario Digno, where they'd actually said, hey, look, workers on fields need to actually get a livelihood that's a lot higher, that's not just going daily wages, but actually strongly increases income towards something that looks suspiciously a lot like a living income. There's also been a lot of government and private sector investment in infrastructure and in developing the local communities there. Could you explain to me why the cocoa sector, in your perspective in Ecuador, has been able to grow so strongly in the last 10 years? And what part of that had to do with governance? And what part of that had to do with just how the market developed?
First of all, thank you very much for your invitation. It's great for me to be here. I don't have any inconvenience that today is a holiday. I want to take advantage of these conversations and listen to your perspective. It's very important. Let me tell you that regarding the cocoa sector in Ecuador, especially the living income was a general topic that centered more on salaried workers. It's true that was in agriculture too, but that worked for a company. So to regulate a little of what they were receiving, and that entrepreneurs could not take advantage of that and could pay for what producers need to make a living. However, in the cultural side of it of cocoa, it's a product in Ecuador that is family grown. It's not that they receive a salary, but they don't, because since in Ecuador you have the right to sow cocoa, rice, and other products. They accumulate different from different plantations what they need to live, and they have access to the different products so that they could make a livelihood and cover their expenses. What has generated the increase in production is the interest of the producer and the work of private sector together with the producers that are constantly training the producer on the work that it's being done crop after crop, and that's how we've been increasing the production levels in the country. However, and I always say this, there's a lot to be done yet. because production, 70% of the producers have between 0 and 5 hectares to work on in very remote areas. However, we have been growing this way, but we don't have any formalization. There's not a culture that the producers can see this as business. There's very little knowledge, not only basic knowledge, and cocoa is a very noble product, and that's why we've been growing. However, if we had access to technologies, if farmers had could cover their basic needs, among other factors, I think we would have 3 times as much as we have, based on what we have so far, and we have indeed grown. And there's this growing interest by the corporations and the exporting companies have grown about this. Ecuador has a very favorable conditions for cocoa production. Prices have also helped. The approach they have and that they're trying to convey to farmers, we're talking about sustainable production. Another approach is looking for fair market, and also improving practices crop after crop. And that's why the sector and the country has been growing. As for the government, in my opinion, there's a lot to be done to create a policy, a state policy on agriculture, specifically on cocoa, because what I always say in Ecuador is that cocoa is not the same as bananas and other agricultural products. And we benefit many people in this sector that we should get a special treatment. In Ecuador, there's no strikes, but for other products, yes, they are. But that doesn't mean that this sector doesn't need attention, and it could be a much better sector, as I said. So in the case of cocoa, an important factor is that the farmers are paid a good price. It's 90% over the export price. And this is, and the price is subjected to what is on in the stock exchange. I think this is important, not for what the government says, but it's not what the government says. Of course, when the price decreases, there's people are not satisfied, but but right now they are reinvesting in their plantations. So I believe that many things have been done to improve production and the livelihoods of farmers, but I believe that there's still much to be done.
Thank you, Merlyn. We've gone through a round of hearing a little bit from everybody here, and there's some prepared questions we still have as well, but I just want to have a look here at some of the questions that come in, and maybe one that's really topical that we see right now, a question from Angelica Kessler. And she's asking, as US funding for governments is also cut, will this improve or worsen the governance in the cocoa sector? And just looking at my whole panel here is, with the current world dynamics around funding and also kind of just the whole willingness to come alongside the global South, how is that affecting your work in your various countries? And rather than just asking this to one specific question, maybe we can all turn our cameras on and have a bit of a conversation about this. It also ties into the question that Wouter van Tongeren is bringing in, where he says, look, a lot of this still is really based on an old school dynamic of the global North extracting value from the global South, right? Is there an idea, is there a possibility to look at this from a more transformative way, where origin countries become not so much a place that export to the global world, but where you actually bring in a much more honest, or I'm not sure honest is the right word, but a much more equal way of actually creating an equality between origin countries as places for them to develop themselves. We've tried to write about this in our paper as well, where these rural development really are about developing the communities, not just turning them into cash cows for foreign currency. Is there a way that you guys see that that's a possibility there? And I'm just looking at all the panelists here. Who'd like to go first on this? Abdulahi, you've been very quiet. Obviously, I haven't asked you any questions there. Is there do you have some first thoughts there?
Yes, thank you very much, Antonie, especially with the issue of the current funding crisis. It really is having a serious negative impact on good governance. I give you an example, two clear-cut examples. One, we had a very successful program we were implementing in Indonesia with Olam, which was kind of looking at forest governance, protecting forests, and also empowering local communities to be able to take charge of some of the issues that have been outlined in these discussions. Unfortunately, just yesterday, we received a letter announcing to us the total termination of this program. So the progress we have made, everything has been ended in the middle of the program. We are still struggling with Olam to see how we are able to continue this. But that is something, that is not a discussion we should have been having now. We should have been looking at how do we make it positive. The second experience is in DRC. In the Congo Basin, it's one of the areas that we still need to protect in terms of forest, but also to protect livelihood of the people in that area. And we also had a program with funding from USAID, which was looking at shade-grown cocoa in the Congo Basin. Unfortunately, this has also impacted on that program. So that program has also come to an end. And now we still need to look at how do we find resources to be able to continue with these interventions that were started. So that is definitely the negative consequences of the aid cuts, especially from consuming countries.
Thanks,
Okay.
Abdulahi. So, like in this broader conversation, we've been trying to say, hey, look, we really need to see these rural development strategies go beyond just cash crop economies towards kind of more self-sufficiency, food sovereignty. Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana are both massive agricultural powerhouses, but also net importers for food. I don't know what the statistics of that are in Ecuador, but if you look at it from this side, and maybe Alex, you can chime in here a bit as well, is like, should we not be looking at cocoa as part of a broader conversation of developing the rural countryside rather than as the key driver for foreign exchange income?
Yes, no, thank you, Antonie. I think that's a good point. I think the question could even be reversed by, do we really need to grow cocoa when we need so much food crops? I think the Westerns, we always need to be careful. The history of cocoa is not an African element of foods. Has nothing to do. So it was mainly to feed a European and a Western market. And I think for us today is not about foreign currency. It's not about Forex. It's more about creating value for this raw material that has become from extractive to important for our economy. Is how to translate that into this revenue and also the success. And I agree with you. It has to be brought in the bigger picture on how cocoa, and this is bring us to also, do we need 5 million tons of cocoa globally, right? And that will bring us to the earlier conversations. While we see higher price today, for us countries is to consolidate that, to build a very good threshold that will allow us longer term to calculate anticipated investments and further bring the system into place. But I think we also need to be careful. And I heard, I think Siapha was saying, I think I agree with you, farmer voice are important. But often people misunderstood that by saying we need to fully liberalize the sector. And this is what many, many countries are pushing for. But in fact, the farmer where they sit, they need power, they need to be trained, they need to be informed, they need to be involved in the market. But we shouldn't expose them on the way that we have seen how the market of commodity is being exposed them. And I think that's why we need to talk about governance. We need to understand what is the role of everyone, because as government, if I discuss rules, it's not the same when a farmer comes and discuss rules. But the farmer voice will be taken in consideration. And we did it in the European Union. We brought farmer voice. I think Antonie knows very well. And the farmer were better heard than we government. And this has helped positioning things. But when we need to discuss certain things, I think we need to divide and conquer. And for me, that's very important. So food crops is important. And we need to see how we are going to feed over 2 billion additional people in the next 30 years on our countries, where we see we have 60% of the people are below 18-year-old. So these are data that we need to look at. And if cocoa cannot be part of this ecosystem, I fear that the mindset around cocoa will be overhauled, as we see in other countries like illegal mining, illegal production here, smuggling there and there, because we are creating a parallel economic world while we need to establish value of cocoa for our economy. So I think for me, this is critical.
Thanks, Alex. Siapha, you want to add to that?
Yes, I think that, of course, I have experienced termination because I have USAID project. But let me stick to the cocoa story because our project is not in the cocoa sector. But I think that it does offer an opportunity, since we're talking here about a good governance, and Alex just referred to it. And I would think that a platform like this, The Voice, should also take advantage of the way the abruptness and the impact is having to introduce some of the issues that Alex raised. That look at Ghana. Cocoa has become a problem. Farmers don't have food, yet their land are occupied by cocoa. So I think, yes, the behavior of the USAID or the US government, but I think there's a silver lining in there. For those of us who believe in an Africa that is resilient, to raise some of the issues that Alex raised. So do we need to grow cocoa? How do we do it? How does that balance with the, say, issue of food security or more sustainable sources of livelihood? So for me, I'd like to look at a silver lining that we should raise those issues. I'm happy. I hope that The Voice could take initiative in raising it, because this is just the beginning, that we may face similar problems where it is driving our development and not our need.
Thank you, Siapha. I really appreciate that input. And I think kind of tying both Alex and Siapha's answer, there's a question by Mireille Fofana who's asking, for decommoditization, if market demand cannot be the only driver of pricing, what are the others that you could add to the basket? And I think that actually environmental protection and human rights are two other aspects that need to be a part of that. And sometimes that's considered to be quite a naive and optimistic and idealistic scenario. But if I look at how in a big part of the global north, we've actually factored those into markets that used to be dictated purely by supply and demand. For example, the labor markets in Europe and North America have got very clear lower boundaries. We use something called minimum wages and actually Merlyn already mentioned a little bit, and I mentioned that as well, kind of the minimum wage systems in Ecuador that we see in different places, that actually we've realized supply and demand doesn't work in the labor market where it comes to day laborers, if it comes to people working in factories. Why do we think that does work in exactly the same context in agricultural markets, right? A commodity is designed to push the price down. That's the whole definition of a commodity, is like the only differentiation is how cheap you can buy the product, right? So part of this idea of decommoditization is that you bring in other aspects to the price that include human rights, that include environmental protection. Now, what I don't think that we've got the solution at yet is the mechanism by which we factor that in, and like, how do you calculate that? How do you evaluate that? I think that there's still a real work to be done. And I think this is also partly the point that Siapha has been bringing in, that farmers and local communities need to be part of that conversation when policymakers look at that. Wanting to move a little bit to, I'm still looking at some of the questions that we have here to see kind of how can we answer some of those before we are rounding into the last 10 minutes of this call. Merlyn, one of the questions from Belén Rivadeneira is a question specifically towards you around the situation of farmers in Ecuador. Where the question is are producers in Ecuador able to cover their basic needs? So like, these are the smallholder farmers that you mentioned, Merlyn. So can they cover the needs of food, education, housing, cost of production, and also invest in their own plots? Now, this question is, with the current prices, I think across the world, that answer is probably quite quickly yes. But maybe I'd ask that question in normal market circumstances. So before the price went up 2 years ago, what was the situation for farmers there?
That's right. Nowadays, they can cover their basic needs, but this depends on where they are located, how they have been established, what kind of farmer you are. If you are among the farmers that have more access, because as I was telling you, in Ecuador, in all provinces there's cocoa, but in different rural zones that are remote, where they have very little access to basic conditions. So it would depend on where they are. Regarding prices, it's true. Before that, it was very unlikely for them to cover their basic needs, especially education for their children. That's why it's so complicated for them to cover all these expenses at that moment. However, there's rural schools within each zone or province that could be remote, but they cannot cover still their basic needs. Nowadays, though, we hope that this situation continues for a long time, and that is established as a minimum over the 6,000 that could cover all their needs.
Thank you so much, Merlyn. One of the things that we've actually seen when we talk about farm organization and governance around these high prices, and I've heard this across Latin America and also have heard this in places like Cameroon and Nigeria, is that with the prices, when they started going above $6,000 or $7,000 a ton at farm gate level, it actually started disincentivizing farmers to sell through the cooperatives, but actually work on their own. And so we've actually seen quite a few of the sustainability programs out there at the moment suffering because of these high prices, because it's actually just easier for farmers to sell to whoever they can sell to at the moment. I think that also ties into one of the comments where it says that, stakeholders from non-state regulated cocoa markets repeatedly point out that their cocoa farmers have fewer pricing problems because of these record high prices. Do any of you recognize that there's like this really complex kind of interaction between really high prices and the traceability and the sustainability programs that are there? Alex, you mentioned some of the smuggling issues. Bakary, is this something that you guys are bumping into in your own work? You're doing a lot of work around, for example, smuggling to and from Liberia and Sierra Leone. Are these issues that you're bumping into as well, Bakary?
Merci beaucoup, Antonie.
Thank you very much, Antonie. Yes, indeed. For those who follow the news in Ivory Coast, in February, agents, government agents were arrested because they were involved in cocoa smuggling between Ivory Coast and Guinea. And when we address this topic, I often say you talk about consequences, maybe not enough the causes. You need to tackle the causes because otherwise the results will continue to be the same. And what's the real cause? Well, it's the fact that some people believe the prices they receive in Ivory Coast are not market prices. So previously, you could work in a certain way without people being well informed because the information was kept hidden or only provided to the happy few. But now everyone has a smartphone and looks at the internet and has access to information. So there should not be false information on the price levels. We need to find a way through which the producers can be well informed. And if this does not succeed, well, farmers will act like they are doing until now with smuggling, and the boundaries with Ghana, for example, are difficult to monitor. There's a strategic position, but at the west of Ivory Coast, with Guinea, the borders are more difficult to check. So a person can simply take a motorcycle and go to the next country. It's too easy. So this explains why in Ivory Coast you have 1,800 as a price, and then the price is a lot higher. Why? Because it's not regulated by the government and because of other reasons. So this should be explained to every person involved. That's the first point. Second point, and
I'm going to
I
ask you to
really
keep it a little
stress
bit
this.
short, Bakary.
The ask we are iterating for 2 years now is that we do not want a liberalized system or free trade like in Guinea or Liberia. That's not a good system. If you produce about 100,000 tons of cocoa, but we need to find a way to improve the system. And the system in Ivory Coast is too rigid. And when the prices are fixed, it's not soil price, but a capped price, which has really negative effects.
Thanks, Bakary. Alex, I think you want to respond to this, and then after that, we'll do a quick round of all the speakers, and then we'll slowly round off.
Thank you, Antonie, and thank you, Bakary. No, it's not really a response. It's just an addition. And I think I agree. And this is why government and farmers and civil society need to collaborate. There are a lot of misinformation. I just give an example. Recently, I was discussing with farmer in Cameroon, and also some in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. And when I told them, look, the current announced price in Cameroon is in CIF, so it's an export price. That includes all the costs until the export, insurance and everything. And you are comparing this price with the farm gate price. So you're already not talking the same thing. And they were shocked. And this is where we need to collaborate, because if information that are given to farmers are not the same, so it's already creating some kind of tensions. But we also need to see that the Ghana model or the Côte d'Ivoire or Cameroon are different. There are other services that are associated to the cocoa sector, like a road, hospitals, and many things. Some countries are taking some fund and do it. Some countries are taking as part of the price, etc. And this is what we need to discuss with the farmer. All right. It's easy to say, well, I want to have the same, but that means you have to go and buy your fertilizer on your own, or you have to do this on your own. So that means that no one will do it, but you have to do it, etc. And I think that the more better conversation we need to have together to really assess what do you want as farmer, what you don't want. But if you don't want it, these are the implications, etc. And I'm saying that because very often the conversation of farmer income become politicized, while we are very, very clear facts that we have to put on the table and discuss. And for that, I will continue to advocate for this collaboration to get the farmers, and Bakary knows me very well. The more transparent we are, the more streamlined we are, the better it is. And I think I want to congratulate again Antonie and the team behind this paper that is outlining few areas where we need to discuss, and that bring us to response. This higher price, what it is, why farmer get this, and how farmer can do more, and how farmer can get more, etc. These are the real conversation we need to do, because everything we do is to bring farmer first and farmer at the center. And I want to give that element because it's critical that we don't overcome each rules and responsibilities in that current sector. So thank you, Antonie.
Thank you so much, Alex. And this whole kind of call that you give around, we really need to work together, I think really is the way forward. And as I said, and we're running out of time, actually, we need to, I'm going to give the last word to Abdulahi to round us off in a minute. That I think that this panel itself is really a great example of how bringing these various voices together can already make a big difference. Organizations like SEND with Siapha and IDEF with Bakary representing civil society from origin countries, but Alex representing the governments for the two biggest cocoa producer countries, and Merlyn representing not just Ecuador, but also the exporter side and kind of the business side from an Ecuadorian perspective. Having these open conversations really is part of the way forward. And so I really do hope that this is the beginning of a conversation and a process rather than a one-off. And so we really look forward to bringing those in with you all. I wish I had time to give everybody some last words, but I actually think I'm just going to go to the chairman of our board and kind of our host for today, Abdulahi, to kind of summarize us and to round us off for today. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Siapha. Thank you, Merlyn. Thank you, Bakary. And thank you, Alex. And over to you, Abdulahi.
Thank you very much, Antonie. I think this has been a very interesting session. It brought out a lot of interesting conversations, and I believe we will take this forward. One of them that came up was the point Alex made. Price is not always the solution, but hey, how do we find a solution? And I also like what he said, we need to come together. We need to work together. And I perhaps think that, Alex, maybe your outfit may need to do a lot more communication in terms of the pricing mechanism in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. There is a lot of misinformation out there concerning the pricing for cocoa farmers in Ghana. And I saw one of the questions in the comments referring to that. And maybe we need to look at how we enhance communication in terms of the pricing mechanism for cocoa in Ghana. One of the key outcomes or takeaways also has to do with farmer livelihood, rural development. I think, Antonie, is very important. That is something we can never run away from. If you look at the whole setup of living income, over 50% of the cost goes into food. And for me, I always say it's not just about food, but it's also about nutritious food. So how do we make sure in all these conversations, we deal with access to quality diet, nutritious food in farm producing areas? You take, for instance, we always talk about child labor. How often have we asked ourselves about nutritional security in cocoa producing areas? And this is a very important thing that we need to look into. So once again, I would like to thank our panelists. Alex, thank you so much. I know how busy you are for making time to be with us. Thank you so much. Merlyn, thank you so much for sacrificing your holidays. And I know it's quite early in Guayaquil or in Quito now. So thank you so much for making time to be with us. Patron Bakary, thank you so much for joining us. Siapha, thank you. I remember we had a quick conversation over this panel last week, and thank you so much for making it to be with us. To all the participants, I would like to say a very big thanks to each and every one of you for joining us. And please do continue to follow Voice. A lot of interesting things are coming up with the barometer. And also, I know a lot of other consultation papers are being planned. And for sure, our aim is to make sure the cocoa sector is entirely sustainable. Without having much to say, I would like to thank all of you and say goodbye. Have a good day, good morning, good evening to all of you. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
And thank you very much, Abdulahi, and thank you, Claire, for all the hard work, and also very much to our translators who are often overlooked. Thank you very much there.
Absolutely.
Goodbye, everyone, and we will speak to each other soon.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.